Let's talk about the five antis, because these are the metaphysical building blocks of what Lloyd Gerson calls Ur-Platonism, and that just means sort of like original Platonism, or like the substrate out of which Platonism grows. So that's anti-materialism, anti-mechanism, anti-relativism, and anti-skepticism. Could you briefly define each of those for us and why they matter?
Yes. The first one, anti-mechanism, says that the world is not just made up of material things, the things that we look at, the things that we access with the five senses. There are intelligible realities. Plato already insisted, and Christians would want to insist as well. There are intelligible realities that allow us to make sense of the sensible things that we see around us. Things are not just put together material items as separate atoms, as it were, so that is what it is. You can think of any poet or any reader of poems will recognize that to make sense of the poem, you're not just going to look at the words and analyze the words, do the grammar, and say, now I understand what this poem means. No, there are things that come through the words, intelligible truths that help us make sense of the poem, and that are the heart of the poem. You could even say that are the heart of the poem, that are the reality, the res, the truth of the poem. A Christian cannot possibly restrict himself to material things and say that the world is explainable strictly in terms of its DNA. So Ur-Platonism is anti-mechanistic in that sense. The Antinominalism is one. I've kind of combined the first two here, the anti-mechanistic and the anti-materialistic elements here. Lloyd Gerson separates them out. I've kind of combined them, and they're closely linked, I think. The antinominalist one is one that we briefly touched on at the beginning when you talked about the various cats. That despite their vast differences, nonetheless have an essential identity. There is something that has the looks of a cat and that makes up a cat, even if we cannot put our finger on it exactly, as it were. We see a cat when we know a cat when we see one, and the reason we know a cat when we see one is that the form of the cat is one that we recognize in the cat, and that corresponds with an idea of the cat, with an intelligible form of the cat in our minds. So the divine form, the form in the object and the form in our minds cohere so that we can make sense of the world around us. The reality, in other words, of those forms, the reality of the form of the cat, the truth element of it, is important in order to recognize a cat as a cat. That's important for all sorts of reasons, including, again, moral ones, and especially in our society today, where the very identity of human beings, the very identity of male, female human beings is in question. It's very difficult to make sense of the stability of created things if you're not a realist in your metaphysics. So a nominalist metaphysic allows you, at the very least, I'm putting this cautiously, but a nominalist metaphysic allows you to place into question the stability of species, the stability of the kind of identities that we have for centuries, assumed simply to be there.
Right. And you mentioned human beings, and that's the ultimate, I guess that's kind of the ultimate created cash out of this principle, because in a nominalist metaphysic, human beings are really just it's an arbitrary word that we place on a group of traits, right?
Yes.
And we kind of choose which traits we're talking about. So let's say that a certain IQ or intelligence level is one of those traits. The ability to communicate is one of those traits. Let's say that but perhaps even looking a certain way would be some of those traits. People have done that. They've grouped people according to those traits before. Right. But guess what that does? It excludes certain people that we know to be human, and yet fall short of those requirements, right? It's kind of like if you cut a leg off of a cat, it no longer fits the definition of a four-legged mammal.
Right.
But it's still a cat.
But
Why?
It's a cat.
Because it has something intrinsic to it that's cat.
Yes.
And that's how it works with human beings. If we don't have that realization, it becomes really easy to mistreat people and dehumanize them.
Yes, it becomes difficult, for example, to say why you should have a child with Down syndrome, and say this child is every much made in the image of God as anybody else, and there's no reason in that case, for example, not to abort the child who has Down syndrome, as we see in our society today. I would make one qualification, and that's an example of how it is that Christians don't simply adopt Platonism.
Right.
So far, what we've talked about is simply eternal essences, but we all recognize that although, for example, a child with Down syndrome is equally a human being as you and I, nonetheless, we also recognize, at least until recently, we have recognized that the child with Down syndrome has a disability. Mm-hmm. And I'm using that word on purpose because not everyone recognizes that today. That child has a disability. And a Christian, and you cannot therefore simply work with Platonic essences, right, because in that case, the mind might perhaps be the most important thing of what it means to be human, depending on how you understand these things. Right. A Christian thinks teleologically. A Christian thinks with ends, teloi, ends, purposes. And the purpose for the Christian is the fullness of Jesus Christ. That's what the scriptures teach us. Plato doesn't teach us that, but the scriptures do. And the fullness of what it means to be human, therefore, is revealed to us in the incarnation, in Jesus Christ. The truly deified human being is Jesus Christ. And our future, your and my future, the future of the child, the Down syndrome child, is one that we cannot begin to imagine even, but it's one that we know from St. Paul is the fullness of Jesus Christ. So the essence, as it were, is not only above us vertically, although in an important sense that's true, but also lies ahead of us. It's horizontally, chronologically the case that we look forward to the New Jerusalem, that we look forward to the fullness of Jesus Christ. And that's where our true identity lies. Our true identity lies, I think, in Jesus Christ. Our true identity lies in the future.